Over the past month, I have had the pleasure and the privilege of being able to experience 3 watches. 3 pieces that I believe to be some of the best mid-tier watches that money can buy you in the Swiss watch category. 3 brand names that are by far the most popular on this platform: Rolex, Omega, and Tudor. All of these pieces are unique, they have their own aesthetics, their own identities. And really, before even beginning this talk, regardless of the model you choose, you're not making a wrong choice here. None of these pieces are perfect. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, which is what I hope to summarize in this video. Before starting, it's good to point out that these 3 pieces represent 3 very different categories. The Omega representing a 1-to-1 recreation of a classic. The Tudor, using DNA from earlier Rolex references, has been able to amalgamate it into a super tribute to past Rolex pieces that now has become a staple of its brand identity and its DNA. The Rolex is the modern interpretation of a classic. So we look at these 3 watches, and you can start by deciding, where does your preference lie? Do you prefer something that is true to vintage, something that rides the line between the two, modern and vintage, or something that takes the modern blueprint in a new direction? And when it comes to deciding on a watch, this will largely help you and your direction in the very beginning. About 6 months ago, these 3 watches were the top on my list when choosing my first luxury watch. The Seamaster 57, a Tudor Black Bay gilt dial, or a Rolex Explorer. And I chose the Seamaster. So I will briefly clarify why I did it. It's taken some time for me to try and understand my own thought process when coming to this. I'm particularly fascinated in watches that not only have a very nice heritage when it comes to their design and their aesthetics, their past influences, but also ones that represent good watchmaking. If I can find a watch that is very well made, that has aesthetic qualities that are not the norm, that has design influences and inspirations that are pretty unique considering what we see today, on top of that with great watchmaking included, for my tastes that's the sweet spot. I feel that very much with the name and the hippocampus. When we think back to the ancient inspirations of Greco design influence, I look at this watch when I see the case, the sharpness of the indices, the hands, how there is this congruent language that seems to translate through everything on the watch. There is a relationship between everything here. The design aesthetic of the watch, being sharp and aggressive, is very appealing. Then we bear in mind that this piece is based on a watch that started in 1957, the first official dive watch that Omega ever made. So in summary, there is this ever-present X factor to this watch that I can appreciate when I look at it from a design front, when I think of the name, when I think about its past, its history. Moving to the Rolex Explorer, one of the most popular watches that I have ever spoken about. I think it's the most popular watch on this channel, and my appreciation is largely based on the simplicity of how everything has been executed here. The quarter Arabics, the triangle at the 12, it is so unique to this watch in particular. You don't even need Rolex on the dial to represent what this watch is. And that's what makes it special. Through a basic understanding of design, you have a watch here that is able to last through the decades purely because of how utilitarian it is. This variant, being 39mm in size, has its pros and its cons, which I have been able to experience now. In the beginning, when I reviewed this piece after having it on the wrist for a week, I praised it largely on its build quality, but did not enjoy the proportions. After having the watch on the wrist for over 2 weeks, did I start to understand it. And I hope to close the chapter off on this watch in a final video in the next few weeks. Where this piece stands head and shoulders above the rest is in its understatedness. It's not something that shouts for your attention. Even in its larger size, it's not something that stands out on the wrist. For someone who yearns for that final one and done piece, this is such a great example. And then to the Tudor Black Bay 58. This piece I critiqued the most when it was released because of the hype factor, because of what people had to say about it and its relative simplicity, how when we look at it from a bigger picture, it's not innovating in any areas really. But as far as a super tribute goes, the Black Bay 58 is one of the best in this category. It's all well and good creating a reissue of a past classic. Everyone does that nowadays. But to extrapolate DNA from different references and cross-pollinate and come up with something that not only has an excellent size and presence on the wrist, has small nuances like articulating end links, a bigger crown for ease of functionality, small touches of Tudor's DNA with snowflake hands, and in this instance, a very flat but also vibrant blue dial, It is a superb first watch for anyone starting out in this hobby. So there is merit to all three of these pieces in their own relative categories, I believe. The Seamaster 57 used pioneering scanning technology to recreate a one-to-one model. The Explorer is this modern interpretation of a pure utility watch, and the Black Bay 58 is a sample of a watch that shows what happens when a few good minds come together to understand what the community wants when they're looking for a sports dive watch at a relatively affordable price. Looking at the pros and cons. Start with the Seamaster first. Pros, I believe, in the Seamaster's camp is that it's not a watch that you see every day. And my experience of owning and wearing it, it feels like almost a bespoke piece next to the more mass-produced watches we see very often. It is a great conversation starter and has started quite a few in the past because people largely haven't seen this before and don't understand what it represents. I honestly don't see the Seamaster 57 as a dive watch. I feel it more like a turnograph, a basic everyday wearing sports watch that also has a rotating bezel. Because its aesthetic is not bulky, it's not oversized, it doesn't have crown guards, it gives off this impression of being a much more casual everyday wearing watch. The size also communicates the same thing. Its quirks are also some of its best features, like a bidirectional rotating bezel that is also a countdown timer. You notice that the numerals are arranged in the opposite direction that we would expect to see them. Another feature that I really enjoy about this watch is the detail. There are 5 separate Omega logos on this watch, true to the original. Because all of the parts were outsourced back in the day, there wasn't a specific template that manufacturers needed to adhere to. They all used their own unique Omega logo when branding their product. So you will notice that on the clasp, the case back, the crown, the crystal, and the dial, every logo is different. The bracelet is far from the standard 3-link construction that we know. Flat link with an articulating center link. It's extremely comfortable on the wrist and wears unlike any of the other pieces in this line. Conforms very well, gives off an old school feeling. Also appreciate that it's 19mm in width and it doesn't taper. When you look at the bracelet size relative to the dimensions of the case, the watch feels a lot more substantial and there is a nice balance between bracelet and watch head. The clasp, I believe, is one of the best that Omega makes. No unnecessary printing on it, it's sterile, clean, very small in size. Of course, you can't talk about the clasp without the micro-adjust system, a simple push button that expands it up to 1 centimeter. The aesthetic that speaks to me about this watch is how well the dial has been done. The quarter Arabics, the sharp indices at every point. The minute track, which is elevated. Reading the time of this watch to the minute is the easiest for me, of the three, because the minute hand touches every single point. The broad arrow hand is stunning, and I would say the most neutral of the 3 pieces as well. I'm sure most of us, even if you don't like the watch or the brand, can get on board with the idea of a broad arrow hand on a dial. It just improves the reading experience, and congruency again between the hands, the plots, it all works here. Moving to the cons of this watch. It is very polished. Highly polished. The bonus is that over time the polish will dull and the watch will feel a lot better, but as it is in its current form, it can be very reflective at awkward intervals. In certain lights, it's difficult to photograph. It can be difficult to read the time. I guess the cop-out we could say was that it was used back then. Doesn't seem to work so well today. Next is the Faux Patina. Of course, this resembles radium back in the day, and the color, it's a richer orange. Also bear in mind that the dial is not black, it's actually a tropical brown finish. Sometimes I do think this watch might look better without the Faux Patina on the dial. It does add to the dynamism on the piece, but also does break up where the quarter Arabics are relative to the indices on it. Another con is the length of the lugs. They measure to be somewhere around 49mm. For those with smaller wrists, it can be a problem. This watch has the longest lug length of all the pieces in this category. Pros and cons of the Rolex Explorer 39. This is going to be interesting. The size and the stature of the watch on the wrist is something I'm not concerned about, because when you look at it fully from a distance, the proportions on the dial relative to the case size, the bracelets we can talk about in a moment, the watch feels proportionally correct, that everything has been scaled up in size correctly. What it means then is that you're wearing a true 39mm piece, and it definitely does feel substantial. Another huge bonus about this watch is because of its brushing, it flies under the radar for any situation. It is so subtle. Building on top of that, the case form of this piece, the oyster perpetual styling, is the most beautiful by far. Where the Omega is much more rigid, much more old-fashioned, we could say, this is so dynamic, fluid even. It feels like it was inspired by nature. And beyond just wearing the watch on the wrist, having it in hand and being able to feel these flanks and the curves, it's very satisfying. There is this artisanal quality to how the case has been done that I don't believe the professional models do as well as this, especially when we look at the watch from a side profile. Then the biggest, the most obvious positive is the finishing. The building of this watch and how it is assembled far exceeds the other two. The sharpness of the center links, the articulating of the bracelet. It feels heavily engineered but also scrutinized. And that again plays into this watch's utilitarian aspect and why it's so appealing. To the cons of this piece, there are a few. Firstly, the flat crystal. It's something that I still haven't been able to appreciate, even though I know it's something that Rolex does with all of their models. You might be surprised to know that the dial of the Explorer is actually gloss black and not matte. The problem is, with this flat crystal, you can never really appreciate it because of how it affects the light play. It affects the experience. In some lights, you would swear that this dial is grey and not black. And I really believe it affects the watch's wearability and, in my case, the enjoyment overall. It just mars the beauty of this gorgeous gloss black finish. The bezel being flat and not domed means that overall it visually makes the watch look bigger on the wrist. It disperses its reflections differently. Another issue with this watch is the crown and the winding. I've actually tried to capture it between these three models that the Rolex has an extremely wobbly crown in its stem, which was very surprising. And another big criticism that I think is a bit of an engineering issue, which I've also tried to compare between the three models, the Rolex has a flaw when it comes to opening up the clasp. You can stick a fingernail underneath and deploy the watch's micro adjust very easily, which in a way might be a problem when you're dealing with the watch's security on the wrist. And then more of a constructive criticism after wearing this watch for a longer time, the 39mm size is very good. But the bracelet being 20mm, I do believe scaling it up by 1mm, having less of a taper, would make the watch look a lot more complete. Those proportions are correct when we look at the case and the dial. The bracelet is lacking in this category, which I am sure we will see changed in the next generation. To the Tudor Black Bay. The pros of this watch. As far as a pick up and go piece, this has been the best of the three for me. Size-wise, proportions, comfortability, it does it very well. It offers a lot in a small package, and proportion-wise, this is the best of the three. Nothing feels undersized or oversized, nothing feels imbalanced. Everything from the case to the crown, the dial, bezel, bracelet, all has been considered a lot more. I would say more attention has been put into these areas to try and get that sizing right. There is also a lot of detail to the watch, and the nuances are there, like the boxed sapphire crystal. It's a small thing, a feature that its sister company should adopt. What it allows for you to do is not only get some nice visual play when you're holding the watch at a different angle, but you can simply read the dial easier. It doesn't disperse the light, there's no need for anti-reflective coating. And as far as being able to get to enjoy the dial a lot more and the color, this is how you do it. Then we look to the details like the macro coin edging on the bezel, the chamfers on the sides of the case, the raised center link that has been machined extremely well, the touch of the Tudor rose on the crown. Even legibility needs to be commended here. The bezel action is also fantastic. Moving to the cons. This is a bit more of an aesthetic preference, but when we look at the dial of this watch, it is, I would say, the most uninspired of the three. There are no risks taken here, and I feel like that's translated through the entire watch. Though everything has been considered well, it's not something that is dynamic in its presentation. What saves it on the dynamic front is the color usage, but after that, it feels like a vintage-inspired Submariner. Though the batons and plots, even the lengthened triangle is appreciated, the dial could use a snowflake aesthetic just to make it more unique and more in line with the Tudor name. I'll even go so far to say that the snowflake hand, yes, it is unique to Tudor's identity and what it represents, but it doesn't work so well on this dial with rounded plots and batons. The next con, love it or hate it, is the case height. Of the three, it's the tallest, and seems like quite an unnecessary slab of metal on the wrist. By no means does it get in the way, does it hang up your sleeves, but also it feels like it could be slimmer in profile. The bracelet with the articulating center link and hollow end link is really appreciated, But the rivets, also a love it or hate it feature. Are they necessary and do they deserve to be on this watch? I leave that up to you. Then to the clasp. There are many positives to say about it, but the one main issue is without the securing latch, you can open the clasp so easily from underneath. Similar to how I showed on the Explorer example, this watch opens with barely any pressure. As much as I appreciate that the clasp is unique to the Tudor name and that the deployant is slimmer in profile and a bit more comfortable, being able to open it so easily when the latch is up is quite a flaw in my book. So when it comes down to it, it's been so hard to find a clear winner in this category. Honestly, they all have their own features that I admire, also some that I don't, which is why, in a way, I've found them so easy to enjoy and wear on a daily basis. And also why I like to say that no watch is truly perfect. In this instance, I would like to take elements from all three and create one super watch. The aesthetics of the Omega, the proportion and scale of the Tudor, and the build quality of the Rolex. As far as a three-watch collection goes, this makes for a great contender because each piece is unique to its own respective brand and where it stands today. So the big question then, given the opportunity, which watch would I choose now that I've been able to experience all three? I would say that the one that wins hands down for someone that is new to this hobby, the Black Bay, is a great example here. When we talk about value for money, what you're getting, all in-house, all unique to its own brand, it's a great choice. When we talk about Rolex, modern Rolex, being a brand that very much is now seen and oriented around its professional models, the Explorer is essentially a Oyster Perpetual with a bit of a facelift. And for that reason, it rides the line so well that it just makes for such an excellent contemporary model. And then to the Omega category, disregarding price, movement quality and everything else, I don't think there are many other brands out there that can create reissues as well as Omega does. I can name a few, and at this point, one is Zenith. Another we could say is Breitling. I know I've been dancing around the question, but if I did have to choose one of these watches again, going back to it, which would I choose? The Omega. I would still take the Omega. Why do I say this? Simply because next to the other two, which feel much more mass-produced, the Omega to me is a watch that has X factor, but also character. Of the three, it's the one watch that I'm always looking at the most. In a different setting, outside, inside, the way the light plays on the dial, on the hands, the way the hands are arranged themselves, there is more depth to the watch's dial. And again, it's a watch that you just don't see in the wild. And in a way, I appreciate that it's not only unloved, but also is more rare than the other two. So there are a lot of things. I've talked about these watches long enough. It's been an excellent experience wearing and enjoying them all, appreciating their aesthetics. Again, I will re-emphasize that regardless of the watch you choose, you are not making a mistake in this category. As far as easygoing, pick up and go, everyday wearing watches, these are some of the best. I didn't even go into movement accuracy and how well they keep time. They are all top notch. In my case, all of them fall into the bracket of +2, -2. So instead of treating this as an academic, analytical exercise, there is so much more about this hobby that we can enjoy. Finding your preference, not necessarily following the herd, but sticking to something that you like, that speaks to you, is what ultimately is going to form your tastes and keep you coming back for more. Again, I cannot thank the owners enough for lending these watches into me. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, I remain your humble servant. Be well and enjoy wearing your watches.